The offer came on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2021. A man in a company truck pulled into the driveway of a farm outside Vermilion County, Illinois, got out, introduced himself as a regional acquisitions representative for a corporate agricultural management group based in Chicago, and told the farmer standing in front of him that his company was prepared to offer $2,400,000 for the land, the buildings, and the operation as a going concern. The farmer's name was Harold Fitch. He was 63 years old. He had been farming this ground for 31 years. He listened to the offer with the focused attention he gave to everything, quietly, without interrupting, letting the number land and settle before he responded to it. Then he said, "I'm not selling." The acquisitions representative said the offer was significantly above current market rate for comparable acreage in the county. Harold said he understood that. The representative said the offer had a 30-day window before it would be revised. Harold said he understood that too. The representative asked if Harold wanted to discuss the terms in more detail before making a final decision. Harold said no. The representative shook his hand, got back in his company truck, and drove away. Harold watched the truck disappear down the county road. Then he walked back to his equipment shed, where a Massey Ferguson 3070 with 14,000 hours on it was sitting with its hood open, waiting for him to finish replacing the fuel injector he'd been working on before the truck pulled in. He picked up his wrench and went back to work. Nobody who had been watching Harold Fitch's operation in 2001, when he bought that Massey Ferguson for $6,000 at a farm auction outside Danville, would have predicted the moment in the driveway 20 years later. Nobody who had seen the check he wrote that day, or heard the comments at the elevator afterward, or understood the state of his finances in the spring of 2001, would have drawn a line between that purchase and a $2.4 million offer that he turned down without sitting down. But the line was there. It had always been there. It just took 20 years to see it clearly. Harold Fitch had inherited 620 acres from his father in 1990. The land was in Vermilion County, a mix of corn and soybean ground that his father had assembled across 4 decades of careful purchasing. The inheritance came with a mortgage that had 9 years left on it, and equipment that was aging in the way equipment ages when the owner has prioritized land payments over machine upgrades. Serviceable, but showing its history. Harold was 32 years old when he took over. He had been farming alongside his father since he was 16, and had a practical education in the operation that no university program could have provided. He understood the ground, which fields held moisture, which ones drained fast, which ones needed a lighter touch with heavy equipment in a wet spring. He understood the machinery, what the sounds meant, when to push and when to back off, how to read a diesel engine the way you read a person, by what it tells you when it's under stress. What he did not have was capital. The mortgage payments consumed a significant portion of his operating income. Input costs were rising faster than commodity prices in the early 1990s, and the thin margins that had been manageable for his father's debt-free operation were less manageable for Harold's mortgaged one. He did not expand. He did not upgrade equipment. He maintained what he had with the focused attention of someone who understood that a breakdown during planting or harvest was not just a mechanical problem, it was a financial one, compounding across the days the machine sat instead of worked. By 2001, the mortgage was paid. Harold had made the final payment in December of 2000 and had stood in his kitchen afterward and done the math on what the debt elimination meant for his operating position. It meant that the fixed cost pressure that had been defining his decisions for a decade was gone. It meant he had room. Not extravagant room, but real room. The kind that lets a person make a decision that the numbers support without requiring them to borrow to support it. The Massey Ferguson 3070 appeared at an estate auction in April of 2001. It had been owned by a farmer in Edgar County who had died the previous winter. The machine had 7,800 hours on it. The paint was mostly gone. One of the rear fenders had been repaired with a piece of sheet metal that didn't quite match. The cab had a crack in the windshield that someone had sealed with silicone, but the engine ran clean. The hydraulics were strong. The transmission shifted without grinding through every gear Harold tested. The service records, bundled in an envelope that the estate had taped to the steering column, showed oil changes every 100 hours for the previous 4 years and a full hydraulic pump rebuild 18 months before the owner died. Harold walked around the machine twice. He started the engine and let it run for 10 minutes. He engaged the PTO and watched the RPM hold steady under load. He checked the dipstick twice. He looked at the service records twice. Then he found a spot near the back of the auction crowd and waited. The bidding opened at 4,000. It moved to 5 in 2 increments. Harold raised his hand at 5,000 and held it as the auctioneer worked the crowd for a competing bid. No one moved. The auctioneer dropped to $50 increments. 5,050, 5,100. At 6,000, Harold was still the only bidder. Sold. He wrote the check and drove the Massey Ferguson home on a trailer that afternoon. He parked it in the shed next to his older machines and stood looking at it for a while before going inside for dinner. His neighbor, a man named Tom Beckley, who farmed 800 acres to Harold's west and had been watching the auction from the front of the crowd, stopped by the following morning. Tom walked into the shed, looked at the Massey Ferguson, looked at Harold and said, "You paid 6,000 for that?" Harold said, "I did." Tom said, "You could have bought a decent used deer for that money." Harold said, "I looked at the deer. This one's better." Tom looked at the cracked windshield, the mismatched fender repair, the faded paint. He shook his head. He said, "You got taken, Harold." Harold said, "Time will tell." Tom drove home. Harold opened the hood of the Massey Ferguson and went back to the fuel system inspection he'd started the previous evening. The spring of 2001 was wet. Planting in Vermilion County ran 2 weeks behind schedule as rain kept fields too soft for equipment. When the ground dried enough to work, every farmer in the county was trying to get into their fields simultaneously, and the difference between operations that could push through marginal conditions and operations that had to wait was measured in planting date, which was measured in yield, which was measured in dollars at the elevator in November. Harold pushed through. The Massey Ferguson 3070 with its 4-wheel drive capability handled conditions that his older 2-wheel drive machines would have struggled with. He finished planting 5 days before Tom Beckley, who was running a newer but 2-wheel drive John Deere as his primary tractor and had waited for drier conditions that came late. That fall, Harold's corn yielded 8 bushels per acre above the county average. Tom Beckley's came in 3 bushels below. The gap between them was partly weather, partly field position, partly soil type, but part of it, a real and measurable part, was planting date, and planting date had been determined in the wet spring of 2001 by which machine could handle the conditions. Harold didn't say anything about it at the elevator. He didn't need to. The numbers were his, and he knew what they meant. Tom Beckley bought a new John Deere 8420 in the spring of 2002. Financed over 7 years, $118,000. It was a fine machine. Nobody disputed that, and it solved the traction problem that the 2001 planting season had revealed. Tom mentioned the purchase at the co-op in a way that made clear he considered the matter of modern equipment settled. He did not mention that Harold had solved the same problem the previous year for $6,000. Harold did not mention it either. He was too busy running his operation to give much attention to his neighbor's equipment choices. He had his own numbers to manage. The years between 2001 and 2008 were, for Harold Fitch, a period of accumulation. Not dramatic accumulation. Not the aggressive expansion on borrowed capital that characterized the farm boom years for many operations, but the steady, quiet accumulation of a man who has eliminated his fixed cost burden and is now channeling the margin it created into his land and his equipment and his operating reserve. He bought 40 acres in 2003 from a retiring farmer who wanted a quick sale. He paid cash. He bought an additional 80 acres in 2005 through a private transaction with an estate. He paid cash for that too. Neither purchase was large enough to attract much attention. Together, they brought his total acreage to 740. The Massey Ferguson 3070 accumulated hours, 9,000 by 2003, 10,000 by 2005. Harold rebuilt the clutch in 2004, 2 days in the shed, parts cost $480. He replaced the radiator in 2006. He overhauled the hydraulic pump in 2007, catching wear during a preseason inspection the way he always caught things, early enough to address them before they became failures. Tom Beckley, meanwhile, was making payments on the John Deere 8420 and had added a new planter in 2004 and a new combine in 2006. His equipment was impressive and current and financed. His operation looked, from the outside, like a successful modern farm. From the inside, it was an operation carrying the specific weight of equipment debt that requires commodity prices to stay within a range that markets do not guarantee. In 2008, the range broke. The financial crisis of 2008 hit agricultural credit the way it hit every other form of credit. Suddenly, comprehensively, and without regard for whether the individual borrower deserved the consequences. Banks that had been extending agricultural loans with relative generosity through the mid-2000s tightened their standards in ways that were felt immediately by operations carrying significant equipment debt. Tom Beckley's operating line of credit was reviewed in the spring of 2009. The bank reduced it by 30%. The reduction didn't threaten the farm's survival, but it constrained Tom's ability to cover input costs for the season without drawing on reserves he'd planned to use differently. He managed. But the management required decisions: which fields to plant at full rate, which ones to scale back, where to cut costs without cutting yield more than the cost savings justified. That Harold Fitch did not have to make that spring, because Harold Fitch had no equipment debt and a full operating line that the bank had no reason to review. Harold planted all 740 acres at full rate in 2009. He finished on time. His yields were above county average. He sold into a market that, while depressed from its 2008 highs, was still sufficient to show a positive operating margin on a farm with no fixed debt obligations. Tom Beckley had a harder year. He didn't discuss it directly, but the signs were visible to anyone paying attention. The fields that went in late, the input rates that were lower than the previous year, the combine that sat an extra week before harvest started because Tom was waiting on a parts order he'd delayed longer than he should have. Harold said nothing about any of it. He kept his operation moving and his accounting clean and his Massey Ferguson running. The machine crossed 11,000 hours in the fall of 2009. Harold noted it in his maintenance log and changed the oil. There is a specific kind of satisfaction that is available only to people who have made a decision that looked wrong to everyone around them, and then watched it turn out to be right over a long enough period that the rightness is no longer debatable. It is not a loud satisfaction. It does not announce itself. It does not require the people who thought the decision was wrong to admit they were wrong. It exists independently of their acknowledgement, as a private accounting between the person who made the decision and the consequences that followed. Harold had that satisfaction in the fall of 2009. He did not express it. He would not have known how to express it without it sounding like something other than what it was. He just kept the maintenance log and changed the oil and went back to work, the way he always went back to work, without ceremony and without the need for anyone to confirm what his own numbers were already telling him. Between 2010 and 2018, Harold Fitch's farm became, without anyone announcing it or designing it that way, one of the most financially solid operations in Vermilion County. He bought 60 acres in 2011, cash. He bought another 120 in 2014, cash from an estate sale where the heirs wanted a quick transaction, and Harold could offer one because Harold always had the reserves to move when something was priced correctly. His total acreage reached 920 by 2015, all of it owned free and clear. Tom Beckley sold 80 acres in 2013 to service equipment debt that had compounded in ways the original financing schedule hadn't anticipated. He kept farming. He remained a capable operator and a decent neighbor. But the shape of his operation had changed from the one he'd been building in 2002, and the change had been driven by the cost of the equipment he'd financed to replace the traction problem that Harold had solved in 2001 for $6,000. Harold did not say this. He did not think in those terms. He thought in terms of his own operation, his own numbers, his own ground. What his neighbors did with their finances was their business. He had his own to manage. What Harold had built by 2015 was not visible in the way that large, flashy operations are visible. He was not running the newest equipment. He was not farming the most acres in the county. He was not the name that came up first when people talked about successful farming in Vermilion County. He was the name that came up when someone asked who had been doing it the same way, correctly, for 25 years without a crisis. That distinction mattered more than it appeared to. Farming is a business where the absence of crisis is not a neutral condition. It is an active achievement, the result of decisions made correctly across years when correct decisions are not always obvious, and the pressure to make a different kind of decision is constant and comes from multiple directions at once. Banks want you to borrow more. Equipment dealers want you to upgrade. Neighbors who are expanding want validation that expansion is the right move. The market, in its good years, makes aggressive decisions look wise. Harold had resisted all of it, not from stubbornness and not from a philosophical opposition to growth, but from a clear-eyed accounting that told him every year what his operation could support without risk and what it couldn't, and a discipline that kept his actual decisions inside that line, even when the line felt conservative. The result, by 2015, was 920 acres owned free and clear, equipment that was aging but maintained to a standard that kept it reliable, an operating reserve that gave him the ability to move quickly when land came available at the right price, and a cash flow that was positive in most years and survivable in bad ones. That was what $2,400,000 was eventually going to be offered for. Not the land alone. The land was a large part of it, but not all of it. What the acquisitions representative in 2021 was pricing was the totality of what Harold had built. The land, the infrastructure, the operational history, the demonstrated productivity of a farm that had been run correctly for 3 decades. The $6,000 Massey Ferguson was not on the balance sheet, but it was in the foundation of everything that was. The Massey Ferguson 3070 crossed 13,000 hours in 2016. Harold had the engine inspected that year by a mechanic in Danville who had been working on Massey Ferguson equipment for 25 years. The mechanic pulled the valve cover, checked the rocker arms, looked at the injectors, and told Harold the engine was running cleaner than most machines he saw at half that hour count. He asked what Harold had been doing to it. Harold said he'd been changing the oil every 100 hours since the day he bought it. The mechanic said that explained it. Harold drove the tractor home and went back to work. The acquisitions representative, who came in March of 2021, had done his research. He knew Harold's acreage. He knew the land values in the county. He knew that Harold had no debt, that his operation was profitable, that the land was well maintained and productively farmed. He had built his offer around those facts and arrived at $2,400,000 as the number that should have been difficult to turn down. He had not factored in the reason Harold was still farming. Harold was not farming because he needed the money. He was not farming because he lacked other options. He was farming because the farm was what he had built, the land was what he had paid for with 30 years of correct decisions, and the operation that the acquisitions representative was offering to buy was not a financial instrument to be liquidated at optimal market timing. It was the consequence of a life run a specific way, and Harold had no interest in ending it for any number the market could produce. He turned down the offer. He went back to his fuel injector. He finished the repair that afternoon, started the engine, and listened to it run. 2 days later, Tom Beckley stopped by. He'd heard about the offer. News moves in Vermilion County the way it moves everywhere that people know each other's business. And he wanted to know if Harold had really turned it down. Harold said he had. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what that farm is worth because of how you ran it?" Harold said, "I know what it's worth." Tom said, "It started with that Massey Ferguson." Harold looked at him, said, "I told you that you got taken when you bought it, $6,000 for that thing." "I said it then and I was wrong. I've been wrong about that since 2001, and I never said it directly. I'm saying it now." Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tom, you didn't need to say it. I knew what I was looking at." Tom said, "I know you did. That's the part I got wrong." He drove home. Harold walked back to the shed. The Massey Ferguson was sitting where it always sat. Hood closed now, engine cool, 14,000 hours on the meter, and a fuel injector that had been replaced that week and would not need attention again for a long time. $6,000 in April of 2001. A cracked windshield and a mismatched fender and a service record that told the truth about how the previous owner had maintained it, and a decision made at the back of an auction crowd by a man who knew what he was looking at. $2,400,000 in March of 2021. Turned down without sitting down, because the thing that had been built across 20 years was not for sale. It had never been for sale. It had been built to last. And it had. The Massey Ferguson is still in the shed. Harold starts it every spring. The engine runs clean. The hydraulics respond. The machine does what it was purchased to do in 2001 and has been doing every season since. Nobody saw it coming. Harold saw it coming. He saw it the moment he checked the dipstick in an auction yard outside Danville and understood what the number on the service record meant and raised his hand at $6,000 while the crowd waited for someone smarter to bid. Nobody smarter bid. Harold drove it home. And 20 years later, that was still the whole story.